The Dell G16 gaming laptop versus the Acer Nitro V16. Which is the better buy? If at any point during the video you want to check out either of these laptops, there's Amazon links below for the US, UK, Canada, and international links. But let's compare the G16, the 7630 that is, versus the Nitro V16. Firstly, the build quality. The G16's build looks and feels like a much more expensive laptop when compared to the Nitro V16. That being said, fit and finish was just okay here, with quite a lot of misaligned panels and inconsistent gaps. The trackpad was the most obvious, with the left side sitting further down than the right, as well as the gap being bigger on the left side than the right, which was a little bit weird. But the actual materials is better, though the fit and finish on the V16 is better. But on the V16, it definitely feels durable, but it definitely does not feel as premium as the G16. They really do feel like they're in different classes, but the V16 has really good fit and finish. All the panels line up perfectly, so I guess there's things to be said for both. For ports, they're very similar, but the G16 has 3 USB Type-A's, 1 USB Type-C, an HDMI 2.1, and an RJ45 Ethernet port, then a mic and headphone port. Ports are exactly the same here, minus 1 USB Type-A, and it adds a Kensington lock. But yeah, I do prefer having 3 USB Type-A's. However, it's not too big of a deal to get a USB hub with that USB Type-C. Now for the brains and power plant of these gaming laptops, the CPU and GPU, they actually use 2 different ones for the CPU. Dell uses Intel with the i7-13650HX, or you can get an i9 in this, while the Acer Nitro uses a Ryzen 7 8845HS. They both use an RTX 4060, and the Dell G16, we priced these pretty much perfectly. At those price points, the Dell has 16 gigabytes of RAM, while the Nitro has 32 gigabytes of RAM, and both of them use SSDs for their boot drive, and you can get those in 1 terabyte and plus variants. But let's get to the meat and the potatoes, the performance. On both of these, we are running a resolution of 1920 by 1200, which is the Nitro's native resolution, and then I'll also be giving performance numbers for the G16 on its higher 1440p basically resolution. Okay, so the G16 on Black Ops 6 with all of these settings maxed out in extreme with a 1920 by 1200 resolution had a low, average, and high FPS of 81, 87, and 94 respectively. So 87 was its average frame rate. For the Nitro V16, this hit 65, 82, and 95 FPS, which obviously means 82 FPS is its average. So there is not too much of a difference, 87 versus 82. Now when moving these settings down to balanced in Black Ops 6, the G16 got 100, 105, and 127, with 105 being its average. The Nitro V16 got 100, 110, and 125 FPS, with 110 being its average FPS. So with the settings maxed out in Black Ops 6, the G16 actually did better, but in the balance setting, the V16 did better. Now really, they're pretty much doing the same. The V16 did a little bit better in balance, but really they're pretty much on the same level. You know, obviously there is a difference between the CPU, but the GPU is the same, and pretty much we're seeing the same-ish performance. Now when moving to Forza Horizon 5, fully maxed out. That's not just in the fully maxed out preset, but also maxing out everything like ray tracing, everything at a 1920 by 1200 resolution. The G16 did 71 FPS, 77 FPS, and 84 FPS, with the average obviously being 77 FPS. The V16 on the other hand did 64, 70, and 80, with 70 being its average FPS. So you can see there, 77 to 70, there is definitely a performance increase on the G16, but it is slight. It is across the board there, so I think that we can be certain that maybe Forza Horizon 5 uses more CPU. Now, bumping the settings down to the high preset gave the G16 124, 135, and 150 FPS, with obviously 135 being its average FPS. The V16 hit 123, 125, and 140 FPS, and again, the same thing stands here. Across the board, it's slightly higher, but still not a huge difference in terms of performance. Both are still very respectable. Now, in an older game, Battlefield 1, we actually got some different findings here. This is again using a 1920 by 1200 resolution with all of the settings completely maxed out. The G16 hit 87, 111, and 138 FPS, with 111 being its average FPS. The V16, on the other hand, did 106, 127, and 165 FPS, with obviously its average FPS FPS of 127, which is better than the G16. Now here the performance gain by the V16 is actually pretty extreme. That's pretty substantially more, and this probably comes down to optimization, AMD versus Intel, things like that. Now I'm also gonna give performance numbers on the G16 in its full 2560 by 1600 resolution at the end of the video, so stick around for those numbers. But right now, let's move on to cooling because it gets really interesting. For the G16, this is its biggest weakness. The fans had to stay on and spool up significantly more than the V16. The fans are also significantly louder here. Not just this, but the overall efficiency of the cooling is not even close to as good as the Acer. The G16 thermal throttled quite a lot, and even with manually setting the fans all the way up, temps were still too hot for my preference, with games stuttering and heavily crashing during testing on a few occasions. That was not all of the time, but this did thermal throttle. It did happen. We had to close everything, wait for it, manually set the fans, boot it back up. This never happened on the V16. Not just this, but the programming on the fan speed was really, really bad. The fans did not spool up quick enough, but instead would wait for the temps to basically rise and go into the red and then spool up. But even then, when the temps were so high that it was starting to thermal throttle, the fans would not kick up to 100% output, which to me is just weird. And obviously those were we tried all of the different settings that they had. It's preset settings, just let the laptop do what it wanted to do. But the fans really never went to 100%, which is just crazy to me with the temps that it was hitting. This really should have been able to do that on its own, but we had to manually set the fan speed to 100%. Now at that point, it didn't thermal throttle when we just manually set it 100%. It's very loud, obviously. Now we compare that to the Nitro V16. This is actually the Acer's biggest benefit. The fans never even once needed to spool all the way up, and most of the time while using this, not even gaming, but just using the laptop, it was completely quiet. Either the fans were completely off or I just could not hear them. When not gaming, the fans would intermittently turn on, cool it, and then turn back off. It was really quite good, and most of the time the fans are not on. Now, when gaming, even for hours, temps stayed icy, and again, that's with the fans never even spooling up all the way, never once. Now, you can use the built-in Nitro software to set fan speed manually, and these things can really do an excellent job of cooling. If for some reason you're in a really hot environment and you need to just pump those fans, this thing cools down like absolutely crazy. It is really impressive here. Additionally, the G16 had to constantly throttle its fans back and higher and lower and just all over the place. It seemed like it was being very reactive, whereas the Acer Nitro V16 just kept itself at one fan speed pretty much most of the time when you're gaming. Sometimes it would set it differently, but then it would just sit there and the temps just stayed perfect. It was way less annoying and the temps were far better. That's the biggest benefit of the Acer Nitro V16. Now let's talk about the WASD test, which is my personal test, and that's for how hot the actual deck of the keyboard gets, but more specifically the WASD keys while gaming. The G16 here, the keyboard stays warm to the touch even when not gaming regardless. If the laptop's on, the WASD keys are warm. After gaming for a long time, the keys actually get fairly hot, especially around the keys, hotter than I would like. On the Nitro V16, it's no surprise with that cooling, but also the thermal insulation between the keyboard and the actual hot components, so good. Literally it's cold. You don't even feel warmth when you're gaming for long hours, which is really impressive. There's literally one spot that kind of got slightly warm on the top above the keyboard, but literally that one spot that was the hottest point on the deck of the keyboard or slightly above the keyboard was still way cooler than any part of the top of the keyboard on the G16, so pretty stark difference there. With that, let's talk about the panel, the screen. How is it? Pretty important on a gaming laptop. Well, the G16 takes the cake here. It is the better screen. This has essentially a 1440p resolution with slightly more pixels on the top and bottom, so it's a 16 by 10 instead of 16 by 9, which is nice to have on a laptop. Both the Acer Nitro V16 as well as the G16 have that taller aspect ratio, which I do like. However, the G16 has a 2560 by 1600 resolution, which is essentially 1440p, but, well, taller, right? The Acer Nitro V16 has a 1920 by 1200 resolution, so a 1080p resolution. Not just that, but the G16 hits 240 Hz, whereas the Acer Nitro V16 only hits 165 Hz. Now, me personally on a laptop, no one's really going to be hitting 240 hertz in most games unless you're just a CSGO player or games that are very easy to run. So me personally, I don't think the 240 is as big of a deal on a laptop. Having the 1440p is really nice, but it's not that big of a difference because the PPI is still very tight, regardless of which one you go with. It is still a small screen size. That being said, for brightness, they're pretty much both even there at 300 nits on the Nitro V16 and 317 nits on the G16. Now, for color accuracy on both, it was okay. It wasn't wildly off. The color temperature wasn't like too far off. The colors didn't look crazy, but it's not perfect at the same time. Both of them are pretty much in that same spot, which is exactly what I expected, and that's fine. The difference here is saturation. On the Nitro V16, the colors were not as saturated as they should be, whereas on the G16, they were very well saturated and overall looked beautiful. For sure, the G16 has the better screen here. Now moving into ambient noise when gaming. So this is, we set up a game, we played it for quite a long time, and then we just took the ambient noise with letting the laptop do its thing, run how it wants to, so it's setting its own fan speed, which again is a little unfair because the G16 doesn't really set it high enough in my opinion. The fan noise on the V16 was between 40 and 41 decibels, which is very good. The G16 here was 43.3 decibels, but again, I do think the fans should have been a little bit higher, so if you're running temps how you would want them to be run, that's going to be closer to 45 decibels. The difference is pretty substantial. Also, the tone at which the fans put out on the V16 is not very aggressive. It's not harsh at all. The G16, it's not terrible, don't get me wrong, but it's just a little bit more harsh than the V16. Now, for the keyboard and trackpad, it's no surprise that the G16 absolutely is the better one here. The keyboard here is a literal mechanical keyboard. While it does have quite a bit of spring ping, so it kind of has that like springy sound, the feeling is absolutely excellent. It's one of the best laptop keyboards out there. This also has full RGB backlighting, which really looks quite good. The trackpad here also has a nice weight, a good amount of travel, and while it's not perfectly like even and centered, it still feels far better than the Nitro V16. Now don't get me wrong, the V16 is not bad. The keyboard here lights up in orange, it looks good and it gets nice and bright. Does a good job feeling tactile, not like a mechanical keyboard obviously, but it doesn't feel like anything premium, but it still does a really good job just doing what it needs to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. The trackpad here, again, is nothing special. It's not glass. The clicks are a little bit heavy for my touch, although the trackpad is centered evenly, but the travel of the left and right clicks is also fairly long. Again, not a big deal, but the G16 does have a more luxurious look and feel to, well, pretty much everything on it. But the fit and finish is pretty much perfect on the Acer, whereas the Dell had all sorts of panel fitment issues, which is kind of crazy. Now, for battery life, the G16 uses a bigger 86 watt-hour battery, whereas the Nitro uses a smaller 54 watt-hour battery, but regardless, they get pretty much the same battery life. For productivity tasks, the Nitro V16 gets between 4 and 5 hours, 5 hours on the top end. The G16 can get just over 5 hours, and gaming on battery, which I know most of you probably won't do, you'll get a little bit over an hour with the G16 and probably just around an hour on the Nitro V16. So even though they have a pretty big difference between the battery size, not that different with the battery life. But which one should you guys buy? Well, I love the G16. They're priced pretty much the same. Again, there's Amazon links below. For reliability, the Acer is definitely going to be the one to outlive the G16, but the G16 is flashier, it's got a nice keyboard and a better screen. However, both are great laptops, but do be expecting to manually set your fan speed on the Dell G16 unless it gets some sort of update. But again, if you want to check out either of these laptops, there's Amazon links below for the US, UK, Canada, and international links. And if you guys want me to review more laptops and do more laptop comparisons and monitors, obviously that's my main thing, let me know in the comments below. Let me know if you enjoyed this video and it helped you out. This is Type C Tech Reviews, and I'll see you guys in the next video.